Hello. Hello and welcome. My name is Adam Lerner, and I'm the Joanne. Oh, right. Look at that. Oh, wow. You guys are so nice. This is not about me. It's about you. No, it's about Barbara. But I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled that you're here. Um, and one thing we like to say here is that it's not just Black History Month in the Palm Springs Art Museum, but we like to celebrate Black history throughout the year. And we are grateful that the Palm Springs Black History Committee has agreed to co-sponsor this event. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Barbara Gothard. She was one of the first people I met when I was interviewing at the museum, and I was impressed with her then and remain impressed with her ever since I met her. She has a wide range of art practice. She produces an extensive body of symbolically autobiographical works very often that have been exhibited nationally and internationally. And her work includes or evolves out of her art education, as well as has been influenced by traditional leaders in the past. Her work has been influenced by Bosch, by O'Keeffe, by Klimt, by Magritte. I am particularly excited about her most recent body of work, which she will be talking about today, called Contradictions, Bringing the Past Forward, which explores the plight of early 20th century African American homesteaders in the Mojave Desert. And this series focuses on the homesteader stories and the contradictions of her own desert lived experience. And BoxoPROJECTS awarded Gothard an artist residency in October of 2021 in Joshua Tree. And during this residency, she developed the artworks that were part of this exhibition, Contradictions. I forgot to ask you, Barbara, whether the exhibition is still up at the San Bernadino Museum. And I was fortunate to be able to see this exhibition just a few weeks ago, and this exhibition is up now at the San Bernardino Museum, or it's probably called something like slightly different from that, but Barbara will tell you that. And then just to let you know about what a fascinating person she is beyond her art, her prior positions included being a senior strategist for Hill and Knowlton. She specialized in global corporate social responsibility and sustainable development. She worked as a lecturer at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA, and, as well as like a very impressive corporate experience, corporate resume. Overall, she has extensive experience in education, in art, and in business. She brings together a very, very wide range of this experience tonight in this talk. And I just will mention that her education CV is equally as impressive. She has a Bachelor's of Arts and Arts Education from Marymount College in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She has a Master's of Art and Art Education from Long Island University. And she has a PhD in Educational Administration from Michigan State University. This is a very impressive person we have here today. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Gothard.
Adam, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I have a feeling that there are some of my friends in the audience who even learned a little bit more about me than they might have known in the past. And I also want to thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm really, really pleased to share my project, Contradictions, Bringing the Past Forward, with you. And because it's a very important topic that needs to be brought to everyone's attention in my mind. It's my visual interpretation of the stories of African American homesteaders who settled in the far eastern Mojave Desert. And it's really consistent with all of my artwork, much of which is about contradictions. And the title of this exhibit emanates from my own existence as a contradiction. I'm a contradiction. I'm a woman of color living in the desert. My artwork is about contradictions, the real versus the surreal. And these homesteaders' lives, as you'll see, were about contradictions. So you may be wondering, as many people have asked me, why was I, a visual artist, motivated to develop this project? And the simple answer is that the more I learned about these African American homesteaders, the more I was compelled to do something about sharing their stories. But I am an artist. I'm not a historian. I'm not technically a researcher. I know how to do it, but I'm technically not a researcher. So the only way that I knew how to do it was to do it visually. I was also struck by the idea what it must have taken for all of these people to move mostly from the southeastern part of the US to California in a totally new and unfamiliar environment and do it in 1910, and that they were African Americans. And the things that kept running through my mind were their hope for a new future in an environment where they could change their own destiny. And because this was a post-Civil War era in which they moved, and what kind of resilience it must have taken for them to survive, and the promise of opportunities to live free and self-supporting, and to be with the person they loved, regardless of racial identification. The desire to build a community, and in some cases, continue the interconnectedness that they had already established. And lastly, the grace to handle the challenges and the disappointments. And as I found myself reflecting on the similarities and differences of my own ancestors who lived in that era, I felt strongly that I wanted to share these homesteaders' stories, because I think it's important for all of us, and especially for our young people, to learn more about this untold history. So in determining how I could share these stories as an artist, I felt, as I said a minute ago, the best way was through visual interpretations. And you must be wondering, well, what got me started on this journey? And my answer is a one-word answer: serendipity. In late 2019, while searching for information about African American artists in the desert, I read an article in the Inland Daily Bulletin by Joe Blackstock. But what struck me the most about the article, in addition to knowing for the first time learning that there were African American homesteaders, but what struck me the most was this ad on lots of different levels. In the reference to colored men, colored was the term that was used in that era to identify those of us who were non-white. And the fact that it was a mining company, of all things, that was inviting them to homestead. And just as an aside, Adam mentioned that the exhibit is currently on exhibit at San Bernadino County Museum. And I've learned that Joe Blackstock, the author of that article, is and has been a volunteer at San Bernardino for a long time. And I had an opportunity to meet him a couple of weeks ago, and it was really fascinating because we shared the story of these people, and there was just almost an immediate identification with that. And the more I learned about these homesteaders, the more I found myself contrasting their story with my family's story in terms of economic status, social status, community, environment, religion. My family were either Catholic or Southern Baptist, which sounds a little weird, but they were. And many of these homesteaders were actually Seventh-day Adventists. So what I'm going to share with you this evening are just 4 or 5 different areas. First, where my curiosity led me, and then briefly some demographics and a little bit about homesteading and cultural contrast, and then we'll get to the artworks, and then I will take questions and answers at the end. So where my curiosity led me. As I began this journey, the research was only the beginning of it. And what I found as the more I worked and the more I read and the more I dove into this whole thing was that there were an inordinate number of elements to it. Excuse me. And that I needed to find a way in which to organize the information so that I didn't get lost in it. And so I used this circle concept idea to organize the various aspects of the project and also to help me set up a filing system so that when I did need to find something about community outreach, I could go to that particular file and not have to sort through everything else. And there were 23 families who homesteaded in this area. There were 83 homesteaders totally in the Landfair area, but 23 of them were African American families. And so I decided that I would create 23 artworks. And I put this list of chronology together because so many people kept asking me, how long have you been working on this? And the answer at that point was almost 2 years. I was also doing some other work at the same time. But basically, it was over a 2-year period that since I started the journey. And the process involved cold calling people because I didn't know any of these people that I read about or that I found in the research. And one of them was a man named Dennis Casebeer. And Dennis is considered the pioneer researcher about these African American homesteaders. And I'm deeply indebted to Dennis for his generosity of spirit, of information, and camaraderie as I started on my journey. We talked for almost 18 months over and almost once or twice a month, where he would share his information with me. Regrettably, he passed away in February of 2021, just 1 week after our last conversation. And Dennis was originally from Kansas, and his interest in the desert began when he was a young Marine stationed at 29 Palms. And later in his life, when he left, after he left the military, he worked as a consultant for a naval operation outside of Washington, D.C. And during that time, his hobby was history. So he would spend his spare time at the National Archives. And that's where he first discovered that these African American homesteaders actually existed. Two of the things he found were the pension documents for 2 of these homesteaders who had actually served in the Civil War. And that led him to the rest of his life reading and learning more and more about these people. And it was Dennis who suggested that I call a man named David R. Nichols. And David is the chief archaeologist for the Mojave Preserve of the National Park Association. What I didn't know up until I actually called Dennis was that he had commissioned a study, an anthropological and ethnological study about these homesteaders. And he engaged 2 professors, Rebecca Austin and Jenny Bingston, to do this study, and it took them 3 years to do the study. And my project would not be nearly as robust without the input of David, his staff, and these two researchers, because they gave me access to a lot of the information that you'll hear more about. And upon learning about my idea of doing this visually, David told me that he had never envisioned that this kind of an anthropological, ethnological study could be interpreted visually. And I'm really grateful to David for that. Then the next, although I had become immersed in this project, I said to a friend one day, what if nobody is interested in it? That I'm spending all this time and energy and I'm excited about it, but what if no one else wants to know anything about it? So she said to me, well, you know, with SurveyMonkey, if you have 10 questions or 10 or fewer questions, the service is free. So I wrote my 10 questions, and with the input from Bernard Leboeuf, who's the director of BoxoPROJECTS Artist Residency Program, we compiled a list of 16 different organizations throughout the desert that might have an interest in knowing that these people did exist. And I had a 65% return on the study, and 100% of those 65% wanted to know more about it. There was only one organization that had heard of them, but they really didn't know anything about it. And then there were only 24 African American students who were enrolled in school according to the census. And then if you look at 1910, the increase is pretty dramatic at that point. And today, according to the latest census, it's only, African Americans represent only 4 to 5% of the population in San Bernardino County. And while I was looking for other information, I found this ad in another newspaper. There's a website called newspapers.com. And for those of you who are interested in doing any kind of research, they have a copy of every newspaper, I think, that was printed in the U.S. from time in the beginning. And they are now owned by Ancestry.com, but it's a marvelous resource. And this, when I saw the title of the film, The Homesteader, then I started digging into that. And in Black History Month in 2021, Netflix actually ran a copy of the movie. And I haven't been able to find it recently, so I don't know if it's still available through Netflix or if you have to pay for it or what. But Oscar Michaud was the filmmaker, and during his lifetime, he made 30 films. And he also founded a distribution company and as well as a production company because the Hollywood executives refused to distribute his films for him. And then in 2019, the United States Post Office issued a stamp in his honor as part of their African American or Black History Month activities. So what is homesteading? I know that many of you are familiar with homesteading in the Joshua Tree area. But this Homestead Act was actually passed in May 20th of 1862. And at that time, President Lincoln was president, and there were 11 states that had already left the Union. And the cost of land at that point was $1.25. But when you are a former slave and you don't necessarily have any additional income, even that might have seemed like an inordinate amount of money. As a homesteader, you could own up to 160 acres, and that was guaranteed for 5 years by the 14th Amendment. And then the acreage was increased 5 years after that, where you could own up to 160 acres. And the appeal for the homesteaders was entrepreneurial, mining, water company, farming. They could avoid the pains of prejudice and the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, which was less prevalent in the West than it was in the southeastern part of the U.S. at that time. They could avoid the challenges of interracial marriage, and that happened because, not necessarily by choice, but because some of the women became pregnant by the slave owners. And they were also linked by way of marriage and their religious networks and social clubs and political organizing. And what I found really fascinating was almost all of them were registered to vote. And that I didn't anticipate finding. The homestead requirements were pretty simple. You had to be 21 years of age. You had to have borne no arms against the U.S. at any time. There was a filing fee of $35, and proving up in that era meant that you had to certify that you were who you were, said you were, because, and you had to do it in person, which meant that they couldn't, they had to be in California in order to complete their certifications. And many of these people were not literate. So they either would take a neighbor or a relative who was literate with them. And one of the things we have in the exhibit in San Bernadino are copies of, I think it's 5, of the original final application forms. And if you have the time and you're inclined to read them, they're really fascinating because some of them have handwritten notes, as part of their application. But you can see where some of them had to sign with an X, and then their witness would sign. And they had to agree that in year 1, they would plant 10 acres of crops. In year 2, 20 acres, and then 40 acres after that. The one restriction that I found really startling was that they were required by the government to be on site 7 months each year for 3 years. And not only did they have to stay on the property for at least 7 months, if they left the property, they had to send to the government office a statement as to why they were going to be gone, how long they were going to be gone, and what the purpose of the trip was, and when they returned. And the freedom of movement that we have today, if you think about what that would mean that you'd have to do in order to leave your own property, is just really astounding to me. And several people have asked me, of course, where is this area? And it's at the far eastern side of the Mojave Preserve. This is the California-Nevada line, and this is Landfair, Dunbar, the area in which where they homesteaded. And for those of you who know the area, it's a very different environment than even our desert here is. And one thing I want to mention is that This map is from a book which is titled The Mojave Road Guide, that it was written by Dennis Casebeer. And this is the actual map. But he wrote this book in 1986, and when I went to try to find it, it was, of course, out of print. So I went online to, out of print websites, and there was a library in Pennsylvania that was cleaning out their shelves, and they listed it for sale. So I, of course, bought it. But what really blew me away was it's actually a signed copy. And that was just, way beyond anything I ever dreamed I would be able to own. I put this together so that you can see the relationship of the professional relationship of these homesteaders to each other. And what I didn't realize when I saw that ad the first time was that mining company was owned by African Americans. And when you think about that in 1910, it still is extraordinary to me today to think about that. And so they owned the mining company, and two of the men, Massey and Morton, they formed a water company because water was a major challenge in the area. They had to dig down 365 feet in order to reach water, and wells were very expensive to build. So those two men created a water company in which they dug the well, and then they would make that available to their neighbors. And then the Hart's Townside Company was very much a company that would bring in the provisions that these people would need. And I mentioned cultural contrasts, and I think about this in terms of my own family, because I grew up in the middle of Illinois, which is pretty landlocked, and also huge farming communities. Anything grows there, I think. And so comparing, that kind of a farm environment to, and I spent a lot of time as a child, because my mother would send us, we lived in Springfield, Illinois, and she would send us to Alton on the farm for holidays. And thinking about that area where I grew up versus, whoops, sorry. These two photographs are from an area called Buffalo Heart, Illinois, which is where my father was born. And even today, there's no stoplight. There's a train tracks and a building and silos. But you contrast that with the area in which, and the topography in which these homesteaders lived. The similarities are that my family were all farmers on both sides of my family. My mother and my father's side both were farmers, but they had huge acres of land that they owned, but it was generationally passed down from generation to generation. And the differences were that the homesteaders had to apply to the government to own the land. They were limited, as I said, in acreage. The size of the house that they were required to build minimally was 10 foot by 10 foot, 10 feet by 10 feet. They had good farming conditions in the beginning because when that ad was first placed, the mining company that placed it wanted to create a Tuskegee Institute West, and Tuskegee Institute is based in Alabama, where George Washington Carver is known for, they call him the father of the peanut. And they wanted to replicate all of that in the Landfair area. However, when they placed the ad, it was during a rainy season. And so for the next 5 to 7 years, they were able to grow crops and become more self-sufficient. However, once the drought came, they did have to leave, and most of them moved back to the Los Angeles County area. So next I'd like to talk to you about the artworks. The conceptual elements of this project were probably the most challenging for me because I knew I had to marry the stories from the past with a contemporary art form. And when I started this project, I was working on a series of commissions. It was during COVID. And I was working on a series of commissions, 4 by 5 feet paintings. And I'm not a figurative painter. If you go to my website, you'll see that pretty much immediately. I have done that in the past, but that is not what I do now. My style, one of my dearest friends described my style as if Georgia O'Keeffe married Dolly. And they're kind of mystical and they're focused on the subconscious, but they're also about hope. And the kind of openings that I use within my paintings, that's what it represents for me. And the options that we have in life, the hope, is what I saw in these homesteaders. And that's when I decided I wanted to do one painting for each of these 23 homesteaders. And so the next part was, well, how are you going to do that? And so I decided that I would use maps as part of the process. And if you notice in the top upper right-hand corner, oops, I keep doing this backwards. You'll see, I started first with my little sketchbook that I carry. One of these I carry every place with me. And then I started working with just watercolor paper and really light wash, and then the concept of the flower, state flower, and the map, and moving forward. And then I thought, well, what if I used a wood background to make it more distressed? These maps, this one is from 1910, the U.S. in 1910, and this is a map that the Mojave National Preserve created about this landfair area. And so maps became an important way in which for me to show the migration of these people. And then I also determined that creating 23 oil paintings might take a bit of time. So 4 or 5 years ago, I started working on creating artworks on my iPad with a software app called Procreate. And so I actually created all of the 23 artworks that you'll see in the exhibit on my iPad in Procreate. And I got to Procreate by taking a class at the Apple store. I bought a new iPad. I saw a sign that said, sign up to take a class on how to paint on your iPad. So that's what I did. And it becomes very user-friendly. And then I started to work on, okay, so if I do them on my iPad, that means I have to have them printed. And so I made the decision really, really early on to use raw linen canvas, because raw linen canvas that's unprimed is the color of the desert, the dirt in the desert. And it has a really rough texture to it. And to me, that was the most appropriate way that I could have these images printed on raw linen canvas. But one thing I will suggest to you is that the minute that you decide to do something that no one's quite done before, that you find a printer who is willing and able to work with you, because Stephen Bombach is his name, and he is a photographer in his own right, and he here was the way in which I could do that. And one of the marvelous things about Procreate is that it actually creates a time-lapse video so that you can see how I actually created and the work itself. And I just find this really fascinating. Of course, it's speeded up a bit. And this is another one of the homesteaders, Anna Jones. There were several women who homesteaded in their own right. And what you will see at the exhibit in San Bernardino is this image on the raw linen, and then the information that's listed here is actually listed as a part of the label, so that you can go around the whole exhibit and learn about each one of these families. And this one is John Richard Moulton, and he was one of the founders of the water company. And so I used an image of a well, and then I used the state flower from each of the states that these people came from. He was from Missouri, and then you'll see this orangish color appear throughout the entire exhibit, and that color represents the California poppy, which was another way to show the connection between the states from which they came to landfare. And the term expressman is, in that day and age, would be the equivalent of a courier today. And he was literate, he could read and write, and he was the incorporator of the Dunbar Water Company. And this is William H. Carter. He was one of the men who served in the Civil War. He was from Fairfax County, Virginia. He enlisted in 1864 in Company D, the 23rd U.S. Army Regiment, Colored Infantry Volunteers. One of the other gentlemen who also served in the Civil War became a member of the Buffalo Soldiers, whom you may or may not know about, but they were it was the first all-black regiment in the military, and they were the first park rangers for the National Park Association, which is a little known fact as well. And all of these former military homesteaders were eligible to spend the last days of their life at the Soldiers' Home in Sawtell. And for those of you who know Los Angeles, there's a Veterans Hospital at the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and the 405. And this is where am I here? This is a 1910 photograph of that facility, which was then called the Sawtell Soldiers' Home. And this is a 1910 map from that area. And again, I've incorporated the landfare map and the California poppy. And this is another one of the time-lapse videos. And you can see how my mind works, which may or may not be a good thing. But I think it's finished. And these are photos of the exhibit in San Bernardino. This is the entry sign that's labeled that you'll see. And then on the back of that is our other information. And then on this television screen is actually a loop of all the time-lapse videos for each of the 23 artworks. And you see that again here. And then these are the panels that have been printed. And this is one section, and this is another section of the thing, of the gallery. And the gallery is about 2,000 square feet, so you can get a sense of the size of it. And I was determined, Melissa might smile when I say that, to be sure that I was able to replicate that map on the floor. And you'll notice that the red tracks of boxes here seem to be kind of clustered, and that's known as an intentional community in that era because several of these families were related, either sons, brothers, other family members, and they chose to live near each other. And so there were a total, as I said, of 83 homesteaders altogether, but only 23 of them were African American. And these photos are something that I'm just so unbelievably excited about because while I was working on my project, the archaeologists at the Mojave National Preserve were doing an archaeological dig. And they sent me photos of some of the artifacts that they found. So when I mentioned that to Melissa, she said, "Will they loan them to us?" And I said, "I have no idea." So I reached out to David, and fortunately for all of us, and this is the case they're in, and these are the artifacts that were loaned to us for my exhibit. And this is a fork, and you can see the old wooden handle on it. This was a brooch that they found in the living area of one of the women. This was a hook of some sort. This was they called it a plunger, but I think it was probably like for a perfume bottle where you have a stopper. I think that's what it was. And this was the lid of a can in which the homesteaders kept their cooking oils. And what's fascinating about this, it was for cottonelle, which is a vegetable cooking oil. But they actually separated the vegetable oil from the animal fat oils, and which was common in the Seventh-day Adventist practice. And that's just another one of that. Then I was incredibly fortunate that James Harries and Doug Morgenthaler, who are on the staff at ESRI, which is I guess one of the largest mapping companies in the world. It's based in Redlands. And these two gentlemen volunteered their time to create a story map about the project. And this is the website down here. And if anybody wants the link, I'll be glad to send it to them. But it also has, at the museum, there is a QR code that you can just download onto your phone. I didn't know how to get that onto the screen, so, but I'll be happy to share that as well. And here you can see how and the map is interactive, so it's moving as you're reading about the families. And then there's an image of each of the panels that goes along with the way in which they traversed from one place to the other. And then he created an entire section of just all the images by themselves. So I know you may not be able to see this from a distance, but just to give you an idea of size, this was one of the artist's proofs. Oops. This was one of the artist's proofs, which has not been mounted with the wood or the silk braid yet. But just to give you an idea of the size of each of the panels and what they look like. And you're welcome to come and look at this afterwards. And lastly, I had created a blog about the project. It's simply called mojavecontradictions.com, and you can follow my progress from here on, because as someone asked me during the residency, what's the next step? And I said at that time, I really have no idea what the next step will be, but I do know that this will probably be a part of my life for the rest of my life, because I feel like I've only scratched the surface of what's possible in terms of talking about and sharing their stories, and to be able to go more in depth and create new artworks about that appeals to me greatly. And my takeaways are really kind of simple. While often difficult and challenging, it was still a better way to live. And when we think of the challenges and the difficulties we've all faced in the last couple of years in particular, we still have a better way to live. And I developed enormous respect for these homesteaders, because what they had to endure is nothing compared to my moving to Palm Springs, for example. And my life has been really enriched by learning about them and sharing their stories, and about their survival, their resilience. And it'll always, I think, inspire me, and I hope inspire not only you, but a lot of younger people to start learning and telling their stories as well. And I encourage everyone to learn more about their stories. And lastly, none of us live on an island. And so therefore, I want to thank all of the people who worked with me, made this possible. And this is a list of all of them. And in addition, with Bernard and BoxoPROJECTS, we were successful in receiving a grant from the California Humanities as well as the California Arts Council for this project. And then really lastly, several people over the course of presentations that I've been making about this since November have asked me about sources and resources. So I've compiled a list, and this is only one page of 5, that I would be happy to share with anyone, because my philosophy is that we're all in this together, and that the more information I can share with people, the more of these stories will get out. And with that, I will be happy to take questions and answers. Yes? No, it's very much a ghost town now. The only thing that exists there now are the remnants of, you can in some of the photos that the archaeologist sent to me, you can see where the boards fell down from the house, and they outline, where the buildings were. But no, and it's really a desolate area. For those of you who've been in that area, you know what I mean. Yeah. Yes.
I have a microphone over here, so if you could raise your hand so the guests at home can hear us
Oh.
while live stream.
Oh, I should have repeated your question, I'm sorry.
Generally, when and why did they leave?
Most of them left before 1910 because that's when this ad was placed, and they were already living in the California area. Many of them lived in the Whittier area, and many of them lived in the agricultural communities because some were former slaves, and that's really the only occupation they knew. But they left because living during Reconstruction wasn't, in the early days of Reconstruction, was not very much different than it was before the Civil War. And they chose to leave to live in a freer environment, which the West represented to them. Sure. The last ones, as I understand it, left well, most of them left around 1910, 1907, 8, 9. By 1930 was kind of the last time that any of them had actually gone there to do anything. Yeah. Yeah, he's coming around with the microphone. She's coming around with the microphone.
First of all, it was absolutely very informative and wonderful. I'd like to go back to the very first part. When you talk about this mining company,
Yes.
what motivated the two men and what were they mining for? And the other is with the issue of water. On some of the other homesteaders, the ones that are here in Riverside County, one of the other requirements was they had to spend X amount of dollars and they also had to dig a well on the property. What was the oversight for the homesteaders from that act going back to President Lincoln?
The oversight for the homesteaders, as I understand it, was pretty minimal because during that era they didn't have communication capabilities that we have today. And as far as I've been able to find out about the paying a fee to dig the well, once they owned the homestead, they could do whatever they wanted on it. They weren't required to build a well per se. And your first question was about the mining company? Could you repeat it quickly? Oh, okay. Well, as I mentioned, Tuskegee Institute previously, one of them I don't think he attended there, but he was familiar with it. And they had actually interviewed George Washington Carver about how to marry agriculture with engineering, and that was the basis for it. The first mining site that they organized was actually in Nevada. And then they moved into this landfair area once the homesteading opportunities came about. In one of the mines, I think there were a total of 4 mines, if my memory serves me correctly, and one of them was a gold mine. The others were one was copper and some other minerals that I don't remember correctly. She's working her way around.
I'm at the back. We need the microphone here.
Yeah.
I want to commend you for keeping the importance and the legacy of these homesteaders alive.
Thank you.
It's history as well as art, cultural history too. My question has to do with what was your process for selecting themes or information from these homesteaders, what is known about them, to portray in your art? Because they were diverse homesteaders, each with their own story. How did you select information derived from these stories to portray in your art?
Well, as I mentioned, the two women who conducted that study, that 3-year study, they had found a lot of this information, and they made the National Park Association through the Mojave National Preserve made that study available to me. And as I used that as a basis, I found on Facebook that one of the descendants, I believe in 2019, had tried to organize a reunion for descendants of these homesteaders. So that there was that Facebook page. There's another Facebook page that one of the other descendants has created. And on genealogy.com, there is a lot of information. I mean, once you know the names of the people, their last names in particular, there's a lot of information about each of these families and their heredity. And then obviously Ancestry.com is another source, newspapers.com. So, once it's fascinating to me because, I read that one article and then that's just like has tentacles. It just takes me off into all these different other resources that I never was aware of that existed. And of course, the National Archives, because these were government transactions. So there's a copy of every document that these people had to sign that's located in the National Archives website. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, absolutely. Well, for example, with the well that jumped off the page, so I created a well in that particular one. One of the Civil War veterans was actually a barber as a side job, and so I created a barber pole in his artwork. So anything that struck me as I was reading about them, I tried to incorporate in their individual panel.
Hi, thank you for your presentation tonight. I thought it was great. And I have 2 questions as well. The first one would be, I'm assuming that once they abandoned the land, that they no longer owned it and went back to the government? Or as in your family, when land was passed down, it was, passed down generationally. So would that be, was it different because it was a homestead type of arrangement? And then the second, actually, maybe I have 3 questions. When you laid out the map of the homes themselves, so I'm assuming the land was away from, like where was their land in relation to their home? Because it didn't seem as if the home was on the land, or were the squares the home plus the land?
The rectangles represented their tract of land.
Okay.
And most of them had just 160 acres. Some of the tracts were double that once the government allowed them to double it.
Okay, I see.
And the homes were 10 feet by 10 feet or 10 by 16 feet. And many of them had what was labeled a chicken corral. And I think that only 2 had barns. But it was all on that one tract of land.
Okay, so it's the tract of land plus the house. Okay, I misunderstood
With the
it.
house.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
And then in relation to Procreate, I saw a show. I think it was a David Hockney show a long time ago, 5 or 6 years ago, that he used. Was it Procreate? I don't know if it was Procreate, but it was the same concept of using an iPad to create artwork. And I know that you talked about trying to create like sort of like a depth of field by bringing the number out and then connecting it to the origin of where that person came from. Did you find it was a little bit limiting, or that it became kind of more, did it feel flat to you, anyway, when you were creating it, or does it tend to have like layers for you as far as like the actual images themselves?
It's not flat at all. And there are, in Procreate, there are layers. And you can set up the number of layers that you want to use. So this is actually my iPad. And with the pencil, you do whatever. But you can set up, oops, as many layers well, the number of layers you use is dependent upon the size of the canvas you're using. And you can enlarge it so you can do more detail or not. Mhm. She's working her way over. I saw some hands over here, and then work your way across.
Thank you for your talk. I was curious if any of the descendants were able to see your work and what they'd thought of it, if they had.
To my knowledge, none of them have they may have seen it online, but I have not been in contact with them. There's a point at which I would like to. Dennis Casebeer, whom I mentioned as the pioneer researcher, he had conducted a series of oral histories with many of the homesteaders' descendants. And at the time of his death, we were in the process of organizing my trip to go to Goff's to hear them. And so I haven't had that opportunity yet.
Hi,
Yes.
thank you very much. It was really interesting. About the pieces themselves, like, first of all, I'm not familiar with your other artwork, and so my question is related to that. So it seems that you have both the kind of the maps and the photographs, which is one kind of image, sort of rational in a way, and then the painting part, which is the flowers and the shapes and the curves and all that, which is sort of like a painting. So I was wondering if doing this project changed the way you do art. Is this a sort of a different road for you as an artist? I don't know.
Oh, it absolutely is a different road. Because I was working with actual facts, and in a lot of my other work, it's purely what's in my imagination and what's in my head. So from that standpoint, it's a very, very different process. In terms of the technical aspects of the process, are pretty much the same. I use the same skills. My knowledge of color relationships, depth perception, all of that, that has not changed. What I'm curious to see is what I do next above and beyond this project, and I don't know the answer to that right now. Okay. We had. Oh, and this gentleman had a question too. Oh, okay. Okay. I saw your hand up, so.
I'm wondering if you read in your studying about the community that they created within each other, the 23 homesteaders, if any community they created within each other.
What I discovered is that there were 7 of the families that were related. And they tended to cluster around their tract of land tends to cluster around the patriarch's home site. But in terms of school, their children went to school with there were 83 homesteader families in total. And all the children went to they only had 1-room schoolhouse. And all the children went to the same school. They all went to the same church. They socialized, with each other. And the only negative reference I found was with the cattle ranchers. Didn't like the farmers. And that was really the only negative that I've found so far. Yeah.
Barbara, thank you for sharing your time with us today and bringing this information out. The other 2 questions I had was already answered. So the third one that come to mind now is, do you have a catalog of images of any of the people?
Of the people themselves?
Yeah.
No,
No.
because in 1910, there were not a lot of cameras available. And I've seen maybe 4 photographs from that era, and they are so dark that you really, it's almost, I can tell one man is plowing, but the rest of them are so dark, you really can't tell what's happening. And I just don't think they had the wherewithal to take photographs at that time.
Okay.
But I'm
Thank you.
still searching.
If you find it, let Adam know.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Before we say goodbye to and good evening to Barbara, let's we have Congressman Ruiz's team is got something for you tonight. I know, so let's have.
Oh.
Barbara. I wanted to, on behalf of Congressman Ruiz and the Congressional District Number 36 here in California, I wanted to present to you this certificate of congressional recognition. It says, to Barbara Gothard, in honor of your presentation of Contradictions, Bringing the Past Forward at Palm Springs Art Museum. On behalf of California's 36th Congressional District and this Women's History Month, we thank you for your dedication to documentation, visual interpretation, and public presentation of our history through art. Here you go, my dear. Can I hug you? Is that okay?
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And thank you.
I will.
Wow.
Congratulations, Barbara, and thank you for coming to join me again. Thank you.
What a surprise.
Yeah, very nice.